Hello, I'm Joe Ewins, and this is the Vixio Gambling Compliance podcast. In this era of more and more mature markets, Africa is often seen as a land of opportunity, but the continent is large, complex, and resists simple understandings of its gambling regulation. Luckily for us, in this episode, I spoke to Zachary Birnbaum, principal analyst here at Vixio, who closely follows the region and its many twists and turns. We touched on the future of South Africa's massively important market, the influence that the changes in the UAE will have on their neighbours to the south, and whether or not Africa really is a grey market paradise. Zach, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Africa is a very big continent. We could really choose to start anywhere, but I think it makes sense to go from the bottom up, if you like. South Africa as a market has for a long time been one of the more entrancing jurisdictions in Africa and the subject of actual and potential regulatory change quite frequently. Before we get into the details, maybe just give us a picture of what the situation is in South Africa right now, particularly as it pertains to online gambling.
So South Africa, one of my favorite jurisdictions to cover over the last 2 years, 3 years. So much activity, so much uncertainty, so much confusion, which is always a joy for an analyst. So effectively, over the last 3 years, there's been negotiations going on the state of online gambling. Online gambling currently and nominally is prohibited by the National Gambling Act under Section 11. That being said, that does not mean there's no online gambling activity within the provinces of South Africa. So online sports betting, for example, fully regulated across the 9 provinces on an exemption by the federal government, so perfectly acceptable and legal with no confusion there. However, one of the more noteworthy developments that happened during the COVID pandemic is that 2 provinces had novel interpretations of what was permitted as what's called contingent event betting. What does that mean? Well, when you have 2 different outcomes that you can bet on, such as a casino game, you can fold it into the framework of those 2 provinces, the 2 provinces being the Western Cape and Mpumalanga. Mpumalanga is a name that should be remembered throughout this podcast for reasons that will become obvious when we discuss newly introduced legislation in Parliament after 2 years that will fundamentally, if passed, which it looks like it will, change the landscape of online gambling within South Africa.
So to be clear, they sort of retrofitting what might traditionally be considered casino games in some instances into this sort of betting approval that they have.
Correct. It's basically saying that, well, when you bet on a sport, you're effectively betting on 2 different outcomes, 3 different outcomes potentially that are all linked, whether it's a money line, will this outcome occur? Will this not occur? Whether it's a spread or not. When you bet on a casino game, for example, you're wagering that the outcome will be favorable to you. Therefore, because it's a contingent event under that sports betting framework, it does work under that, what I would call novel interpretation of what a contingent event is.
Fair enough. And is that, how is that, to your understanding, how is that interpretation received on a kind of federal level?
It's fractured. It's definitely a source of tension between the national regulator, the National Gambling Board, and the 2 provinces, again, Western Cape and Mpumalanga. And that probably not helped the state of negotiations over this remote gambling bill that we'll talk about shortly. But fundamentally, the National Gambling Board does not have sanctioning power, and therefore is much more of an oversight body that establishes standards and coordinates and negotiates with the provinces who are actually the licensing authorities under the national framework in South Africa. So while they can voice their displeasure, while they can know that this is against the national legislation and this is not in conformity with other norms and standards within South Africa, fundamentally, there is not a mechanism by which they can quote unquote punish the provinces for lack of compliance. Right,
I see. You've alluded a couple of times now to new legislation that has been introduced. We'll talk about that in just a second, but certainly for as long as I've been covering gambling regulation, there has been scuttlebutt about new bits of new reforms on a federal level that would, change the picture in South Africa in terms of gambling legislation. Those for various reasons have not come to pass. But what is it that stood in the way of these pieces of legislation before? And I suppose more importantly, why is it different now?
Fundamentally, it's been politics and social political considerations that have been scuttling, to your point, the prospect of online gambling within South Africa at the federal level. Effectively, the ANC, which has historically been the party of Nelson Mandela, has ruled South Africa since the end of apartheid. So for the last 30 or so years, what's been challenging in terms of online gambling is that the most concrete effort related to federal legislation in that space was introduced by the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, in fall of 2022. That comes from other efforts in the past from the same party trying to push forth like similar kind of legislation with lack of progress, because either for lack of credit or through just not being a priority of the ANC at the time, it was just not willing to introduce that to Parliament. Now, the situation is much different, and we'll talk about it in more detail soon. But the situation at the foundational level, aka the makeup of South African politics, has changed over the last 3 months or so, which gives hope and optimism to the prospect of this passing either by the end of this year or early 2025.
Got it. Okay. So what is this bill then? Why is it important? What's it going to change?
Glad you asked. So the remote gambling bill, introduced by the Democratic Alliance in the fall of 2022. So already you can see it's been a long process of even negotiating through this bill to get introduced, was formally published within Parliament in April 2024. Now, why is April 2024 significant? Well, in May 2024, there were the South African elections. In those elections, the ANC, for the first time again in 30 years, lost their ruling majority. So to put it into perspective, they gained 159 seats, whereas in the previous election, they had won 230. So a drastic fall from that control and ability to direct policy based on their wants in Parliament. That has led to the formation of a coalition between both the DA and the ANC, as well as a third party that, for these purposes, we can kind of dispense of talking currently. But what the bill will do is it will concentrate power in the provinces in terms of online gambling. So still Federal Gambling Board as oversight and standards direction, but the provinces will be the ones issuing the licensing, issuing the regulations in the nitty-gritty sense, issuing RG standards and the like. And the more important part, and that links back to the contingent event novel interpretations, is that the main sponsor of the Democratic Alliance of this bill is the ruling member of parliament for the province of Mpumalanga. So someone that has had experience drafting regulations and framework that fit under the current situation, but also the ability and experience after having done this within those provinces over the last 2 or 3 years to actually know what the issues are in online gambling in Mpumalanga and Western Cape, and then transpose that to the rest of the 7 provinces that do not have the system of betting.
So what would this new legislation allow for? I mean, is it licensing for all different kinds of gambling, or is it limited to sports betting? What's the picture?
It is full online gambling capabilities. So iGaming, sports betting, retrofitted. I believe there is a provision to include electronic sports, so esports, competitive video game wagering, and the like. What is a little bit up in the air is whether the respective provinces will decide to delineate which of those games are possible. Like nominally, and in other jurisdictions, you can have the enabling legislation permitting esports wagering, competitive video game wagering, but the actual regulations might not allow for that type of betting to occur. So this bill is still in Parliament. We're still kind of waiting the finalization of its passage. Once it's passed, we can kind of see the picture of, okay, Mpumalanga is regulating this, North Cape is regulating this. Let's see where it shakes out. However, based on what we have seen, the Western Cape and Mpumalanga introduced as part of contingent event betting, we feel reasonably certain and secure in the belief that at least the Western Cape and Mpumalanga will have full throttle online gambling, iGaming, and sports betting as is was traditionally thought of, and with those probably including esports at least.
Great. So there is the sense that these kind of states that have gone out on their own to create their own little markets. They have buy-in to this project.
Correct, and that's the key other aspect that has changed in previous years. Previously, it was an effort either led from the top down from the regulator trying to modernize their national legislation, or from maybe one province that tried to force their way into having their preferred method of regulation in place. This one has been championed by the provinces of Mpumalanga and the Western Cape. And then after the experience of the last year or two of doing this contingent event betting, they then had the experience to then go to the other provinces and basically say, we know what we're doing. Do you also want to participate in this? Yes and no. They've got their buy-in, got their comments and stakeholder buy-in in the industry as well. So whether it's in operators in the provinces or other outside forces that have interest in the region, there has been discussions and negotiations to get the proper regulations in place. So all that being said, the thought of passage of this bill, the thought of it being assented to by the National Council of States is more at this point in time, based on sources, a matter of formality rather than an obstacle or an issue that reared up in previous years where we thought that the bill was going to pass and then the last minute it was dashed. From all belief, this is not going to happen here.
Okay, excellent. This is a difficult thing to ask of anyone, given the way that politics works. But when is this going to happen? When do you expect to see this passed into law?
My very generous kind of speculation would put it at end of 2024. Realistically, it'll probably be fully assented to by Q1 2025, and then, as is common in a lot of African jurisdictions, a probably year-long process of getting the regulations ramped up and properly discussed and promulgated throughout the provinces and the national country.
Makes sense. Thank you. I won't hold you to that. So let's consider the wider context then, but still sticking with South Africa. So South Africa is a market that's very influential globally, not just within Africa. And I believe our data team projects it will be among the top 10 in terms of GDR very shortly. It's a hugely important market. So if this legislation is passed and sets up a new framework, do you anticipate that being its impact being felt on the rest of the continent?
Yeah, I think that's one of the more important things is, and I'll bring back our data team on this one. Effectively, based on our data, the South Africa regulated online gambling market currently is estimated to have surpassed $1 billion in trailing 12-month revenue in 2024. And that's just considering online sports betting and contingent event betting in the province of Mpumalanga and Western Cape. So that kind of paints a picture of how significant a market South Africa is likely to be. Now, when you talk about wider impact, I think it's important to note that South Africa National Gambling Board has been one of the more and foremost collaborative bodies within the continent. One, whether it's enacting and promulgating their standards in other Southern African jurisdictions, say Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, or the like, or, and importantly, going to other international regulators to have almost a standardized set of professional norms promulgated in the continent. So that entailed going to the Malta Gaming Authority, New Jersey Division of Gaming Enforcement, UK Gambling Commission, and getting the best practice from those bodies. So that's one, how influential from a regulatory perspective South Africa is. Now, in terms of impact when it comes to investment. So based on the last estimate by the African Union, the African continent is home to about a internet penetration rate of 36%. What does that mean? It means that effectively the reliability, the access to reliable internet across the continent is 36%. So naturally, that caps the ability to have full throttle online gambling. Now, why does this matter for this discussion? Effectively, because South Africa is such an opportunity from an investment perspective, from entering the market perspective, that's going to trigger investment to getting online gambling capability, whether that is in South Africa properly, which is already a mature, fully accessed internet and the like, but it will spread out throughout the rest of the jurisdiction itself. What has that meant in the last 3 months, 4 months? We've already seen a ton of online gambling activity or interest already emerging in those southern African countries, whether it's Malawi announcing new regulations in May, or Seychelles enacting new regulations in January 2024 after passing a fully comprehensive data privacy legislation in December 2023. So we're seeing a concerted effort through the prospect of online gambling in South Africa in investing in the internet capabilities of the southern African continent, which is likely to spread over the next 3-5 years as the revenue streams disperse a little bit away from South Africa into new, smaller opportunities, but important and key ones.
Very interesting. I think international operators particularly be interested to hear about the concept of a bit of globalization happening, maybe with South African regulators speaking to their colleagues in the States and in Europe. Always something that's deeply desired by companies, standardization of standards.
Right. Just to add to that, it's something that we've already seen kind of in the last 6 months to a year. Like Malawi has enacted or proposed to enact some of the more draconian might be a strong word, but kind of paints a picture, advertising regulations to try to really focus on responsible advertising of online gambling as they try to promote this type of industry. And like I said, Seychelles enacting comprehensive data privacy legislation in December 2023 is a mark that this is engendering strong interest off of those conversations with other global regulators.
Very interesting. Okay, how about elsewhere in Africa? Are there any other nations moving forward with changes in their regulation?
Sure. I think I've already noted Malawi and Seychelles being the kind of process, maybe some underreported regulatory jurisdictions that could pop up of interest. And again, online gambling is something in Seychelles particular that you can do offshore. They have a list of prohibited jurisdictions in that legislation that you can't target. However, a Seychelles license does enable you to offer your services to other markets that do not prohibit such activity. So that's one market, Malawi being another one. The more interesting and more mature in the process of changing their license system has been Botswana. They've been in the process of fully regulating their industry over the last year and a half, with recently releasing bookmaking applications for their industry. What they will do, with operations likely fully starting in 2025 Q1, is regulate iGaming, regulate sports betting online and land-based, casinos land-based, and that would be more to promote the tourism industry in Botswana. But what's key, and again brings back the idea of globalization, is that the South African National Gambling Board has played a key advisory role to the Botswana Gambling Authority as they've borrowed best practices as they've enacted technical standards, which is important because one of the things that South Africa has is the South Africa Bureau of Standards, which is a body that does not necessarily release their publicly available technical standards, but that standard authority has advised the Botswana Gambling Authority in promoting their own technical standards. So the key thing there, again, is that South Africa as a body is triggering new activity from a regulatory standpoint in the continent. So all of it comes linked in the South to this remote gambling bill, and then the efforts of the South African regulator in enacting its position as a thought leader on the continent.
And if I'm not mistaken, Botswana hosted the International Association of Gambling Regulators last year as well, which surely plays a role in its kind of global view.
That's true. It was held in Gaborone, and again, like, was well received, and the Botswana regulations and regulator is also well thought of based on their openness to borrowing best practices, through their transparency in the industry as a whole, both from a media standpoint and operator standpoint. So it's a jurisdiction that I think will keep hearing more and more as they progress in their licensing. And I think that you will find a lot of international operators, once they've explored Botswana, feeling a level of comfort that may not be currently common in other jurisdictions in Africa.
Interesting. Do we have a timeline on when international operators might be able to enter Botswana? Is it something they could do right now? Is there, is it something looking at next year?
International operators can enter Botswana. If I remember correctly, there is a 5% Botswana equity interest requirement. So you still have to have a level of buy-in from the local population. However, you can enter it. However, what I would say is the market was supposed to commence full operations in April 2024 based on our sources. However, this has not occurred yet. So it's kind of a moving target. And what I would say is that in other jurisdictions, you might think of a delay as like an unfortunate outcome. In this case, I would actually spin it more positively. They've delayed the commencement of operations because they want to make sure that the regulations are properly in place, the applications are properly counted on a public basis, and rolled out in a comprehensive, proper, and regulated manner. So again, encourages that level of comfort from an investment perspective and from an entering a market perspective.
Got it. Thank you. Are there any other jurisdictions in Africa that are of particular interest where things are changing?
I think we have to talk about the UAE. Like, that's the one that keeps me up.
I don't think that's technically isn't in Africa. I don't think.
Middle East, Africa, same like kind
of.
But
I know you do cover that as well, so we should definitely touch on it.
No, and what I would say there, and it's why I'm bringing it up as part of the Africa coverage, is that South Africa may lead the conversation. The South, North Africa, and the North East is very much going to be influenced by activity in the UAE, and I think that's a jurisdiction that you will see in the next 3, 5, 10 years take on a role of a thought leader in that segment of the world as well.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We should talk about it on my travels recently to conferences. The one thing that people are coming up to me more often than anything and asking is, so what's going on with the UAE? So I'm going to ask you that question. What's going on with the UAE?
Well, the UAE is going forward with gambling legislation, which is something that I frankly never thought I would say. So it's already an exciting development in that sense. I think they've issued already a exclusive lottery license in recent months. They've issued a licensing guide in recent months. They've established new AML committees to make sure that the industry is well regulated. The GCGRA is a fully set up regulatory body with a lot of people from the industry. So people that actually are aware of what has been going on elsewhere in the world from again, best practice standpoint. So a jurisdiction that has a lot of weight behind it from a regulatory expertise standpoint. And again, from a licensing standpoint, it's probably one of the more exciting opportunities in that region of the world that I can remember seeing in the last 10 years. I mean, the Middle East is a little bit a desert, pardon the pun, in terms of like gambling ability. The Lebanon has the Casino du Liban, which has been in place since the 50s, but beyond that, you're not seeing much ability to do regulated gambling in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's been sort of hints, perhaps, with the likes of Wynn and other big American casino operators arriving over the last years, that there may be something in the offing. But I think when the regulations emerged, they've ended up being much more comprehensive than we might have imagined. I mean, there is even the possibility of local online gambling. Can you talk a bit about that?
Correct. There is possibly a local online gambling. However, our source is a little bit more skeptical of whether this is actually going to happen. I think the best way to frame it is, if you're familiar with the Nevada model, online gambling is permitted by the regulation and the law. In practice, only poker is actually allowed. So whether something is written in the legislation as being permitted, and linking back to the South Africa question related to esports, you can have a largely permissive enabling legislation that sets the baseline for what you can do from a gambling perspective, but the regulations might not allow this online licensing to happen in practice. And I think you're seeing that a little bit when you read the tea leaves. Much of the activity in the Emirates has been focused on the land-based IR activity, where it's Win, whether it's other bodies, etc. And online gambling hasn't been talked about as much, except for its potential and possibility. And I think, again, linking back to global conversations, there's been enough friction in recent months elsewhere in the world, APAC being a notable one, concerning online gambling hubs that also may impact the likelihood of local online gambling in the Emirates, where they may have permitted it in their legislation and then see what the current landscape is in near their region of the world, in their region of the world, and just say, not for us right now. And I think that's where we're at right now until things change. But again, the possibility of online gambling is there, and even its possibility is tantalizing enough to be worth talking about.
Absolutely. And I think it wouldn't be surprising necessarily to see them follow a Nevada type model, given that there's some experience from Nevada in the regulator, right?
Correct.
I mean, it does, all of this, as you pointed out, is quite surprising. It does beg the question of how this shift towards online gambling lines up with the status of the United Arab Emirates as an Islamic country. I mean, how is that tension being navigated, so far as you can see?
It is nominally an Islamic country. However, what you see in the UAE is a more secular jurisdiction compared to other what you would call Islamic countries in the region. It's a jurisdiction, whether it's Dubai, whether it's Abu Dhabi, that has seen a lot of secular influence, whether that's the energy sector, the tech sector, the financial sector, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what you're seeing as well with this enactment of regulated gambling is, from my view, a pragmatic view of, in the Emirates, effectively trying to diversify their revenue streams. So Emirates, traditionally a oil prominent country. Obviously, oil reserves are finite, and the UAE has been trying to find new ways to sustain its revenue through the medium and long term, whether it's, again, renewable energy, financial sector, and white collar, and the like. I think you're seeing the gambling realm being tantalizing, especially with the reduction of importance of the gambling hub in Asia being Macau, reducing its importance. UAE slots in. It's the right time. It's the proper time. They have the right experts to enact this. It's a lot of being at the right time, right place, right scenario to kind of do this now. And I think that's what you're seeing here.
Okay, thank you. All All right, so we talked about the influences from the south and from the north, as well as some of the other jurisdictions that are of interest within Africa. More generally on the continent, interested in your perspective on the kind of the overall picture of regulation. I suppose it's Africa has typically been viewed by some as a grey market for the most part, served from offshore countries. Is that still true in large parts, or are things changing? What's your perspective on this?
I would be very careful trying to think of Africa as gray markets these days. I think what you have is a situation that, again, regulated activity is blossoming in the South. That leads to an increase in interest globally in the African continent. And importantly, one of the things that you've seen in recent months is other regulators, North America being the more prominent region, requiring suppliers of games to affirm and attest that they have not been supplying to quote unquote gray markets or markets where gambling is not fully permitted. And so what you're seeing there is not as much the African jurisdiction saying, get out. What you're seeing is international bodies that have noted increased regulatory capability in Africa, increased interest in those regions, and increasing familiarity with those jurisdictions, frankly, because they've gone to the DG, they've gone to the UK Gambling Commission, to the MGA, et cetera. And so you're seeing a dual enforcement angle. You're seeing the regulators internationally saying, hey, suppliers, if you want to do business in our jurisdictions, you can't supply, and you have to actually under oath say that you're not supplying or have never supplied to those jurisdictions. And then two, you're seeing increased enforcement capabilities in the African nations, whether it's through monitoring systems, whether it's through increased capabilities from increased internet penetration and the ability to actually track these people. You're seeing it attack from two prongs. And so while there are jurisdictions that would still be classified as gray markets and nominally you can still target from outside of those jurisdictions, if you want to do business in regulated large markets, Michigan being one of them in North America, New Jersey being another one, you will likely not be able to continue that activity moving forward unless you want to run the risk of perjuring yourself.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting, and not the same kind of disclosure requirements as you see in Michigan and New Jersey in the UK, but we've seen in a recent example of Entain coming under the focus of the Crown Prosecution Service that the law enforcement in the UK were very interested in whether or not you had a license where you were operating and whether you should do. So yeah,
right.
Very good point. It's a changing world, I think.
Right. I think underscores the notion of a increasingly globalized world where you're seeing best practices being borrowed on the advertising space, on responsible gambling, AML and CTF, more importantly, and then enforcement capabilities because of that collaboration rising up. So in the next 5 years, maybe, if probably more, honestly, but I foresee a world in the next decade where gray market activity will be thought of in the same breath as black market activity.
And what's your sense of the future, the next 5 years, maybe for Africa in general? You think there's going to be a lot more, thinking about online gambling here, a lot more kind of regulation, or do you think there are things that may stand in the way?
I think we're going to see a lot of opening up of newly regulated markets. And I think, interestingly for me, before this developments happened in South Africa, the first real salvo in the ether that was unrelated to gambling, but tangentially related still, was the formation of a national esports body pioneered by the Moroccan Royal Organization for Esports. So because of that interest, noting that the UAE, for one, is one of the foremost esports jurisdictions in the world, noting that digital penetration is still relatively low, but the fact that that federation was pioneered, championed, formed in Africa is indicative that in the next 5 years, the ability to do esports and competitive video gaming unrelated to wagering is going to rise up. Because that's going to rise up, you're going to see an increase in the ability to do online sports betting, one, and then that will be the funnel to get online gambling through. So in the next 5 years, I foresee probably about like 20-ish jurisdictions in Africa opening up out of the 55 or so, and then moving forward through the more digitally challenged jurisdictions and more, to your point, more Islamic nations within that region of the world. Those may be a little bit slow to pick up, but I think that much like the UAE, you will see a push towards pragmatism and revenue generation in those nations. And I firmly believe at this point in time that after LATAM, Africa poses the most obvious opportunity from a industry stakeholder perspective.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you very much, Zach. Really interesting stuff.
Anytime.
Thank you very much indeed to Zach. For more of Zach's insights, along with other experts on the Vixio team, you can check out the Africa and Middle East Outlook, which you can find if you type that title into the search bar on our website. And if you'd like to speak to Zach in person, he'll be at G2E in Las Vegas next month. You can find out more information and book a meeting at Vixio.com. And while you're there, you may well notice a very exciting launch for us, our technical compliance tool covering more than 65 requirements across more than 20 jurisdictions worldwide has very recently launched. So please do go and check that out and see what you think. That's it for us this episode. Thank you very, very much indeed for listening. I'll see you next time.